Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, January 7th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: military action against Iran is possible under Trump. So Axios reported on Monday that military action against Iran's nuclear facilities will be a real possibility under the incoming Trump administration. The report said Trump is expected to face an Iran crisis this year due to the country's nuclear activity, although there's no evidence right now that Iran has decided to build a nuclear weapon. That's even been acknowledged by William Burns, the head of the CIA. Yet there's all this hype right now about this idea of Iran moving to build a nuke. What I think this really is that the hawks in the U.S. and in Israel, they see an opportunity right now to hit Iran hard because Hezbollah is hurting and the Iran's ally in Syria was just overthrown. So they think right now is an opportunity to hit Iran. Incoming Trump officials have called for a return to maximum pressure, and that's referring to the previous Trump administration's policies of these very crippling economic sanctions on Iran, pulling out of the nuclear deal, the Iran nuclear deal, and the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. That's included in this, that he was the IRGC, the head of the Quds force in Iran's IRGC, who Trump ordered to be assassinated in 2020. And the Biden administration essentially continued this maximum pressure. They actually added sanctions on Iran. The only difference was they engaged in negotiations, but they didn't go anywhere. And also, Iran has increased its oil exports, but that's because they found markets in Asia that are not afraid of U.S. sanctions. So these are companies that they're selling to that aren't worried about sanctions. So more U.S. sanctions is not going to solve that. So Trump advisors told Axios that the maximum pressure strategy might not work, making a military option possible. Sources said that Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer left a meeting with Trump in November, believing it was highly likely he would either support Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities or order a direct U.S. strike on Iran. Back in October, Trump criticized President Biden for advising Israel not to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. If you remember that, Israel was preparing an attack on Iran. Biden was saying, I told him not to hit the nuclear facilities, and that Trump publicly criticized Biden for saying that. So that is a sign that this is something he might support. The Axios report also said that there are officials within the Biden administration arguing for the U.S. to bomb Iran before Trump's inauguration. And it said its senior officials in the Biden administration want to hit Iran. Again, this is about the opportunity. They see the opportunity with the situation in the Middle East to hit Iran. The hype around Tehran's nuclear program is based on the fact that Iran is enriching some uranium at 60% purity, which is the highest level Iran's ever reached, but it's still lower than the 90% needed for weapons grade. And Iran took this step a few years ago, almost 4 years ago now. In 2021, they started enriching uranium at this 60% purity level, and that was in response to an Israeli sabotage attack. So you see this pattern of Israeli aggression against Iran leads Iran to increase its nuclear activity, and then Israel then points at that activity as evidence that they're racing toward a bomb. If the Iran nuclear deal was still intact, that limited Iran's enrichment levels at very low at 3.67%. But Israel wanted that to be scrapped. They claim they were violating it. And then, of course, the context we always have to mention is that Iran's a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but Israel is not, because they have a secret nuclear weapons program. That's right. Israel has nukes, secret nukes. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. So another thing, there has been conversations within Iran, members of parliament saying that it might be time to rethink the ban on building nuclear weapons. But there's still no sign that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who calls the shots. There's no sign that he's considering or moving to reverse his fatwa that he issued in 2003 prohibiting the development of weapons of mass destruction. I know a lot of that probably sounds familiar because a story recently I kind of covered all those details, but I just think that's very important context when we're talking about Iran and its nuclear program. All right, so the next one here, Trump says he's Israel's best friend, or sorry, I messed that up. Trump says he's the best friend Israel ever had and repeats threat to Hamas. So on Monday, President-elect Donald Trump said that he was the best friend Israel ever had and repeated the threat that there would be hell to pay if Hamas does not release the hostages by the time he is inaugurated. He made the comments when asked by radio host Hugh Hewitt if he would provide uninterrupted military aid to Israel. Trump said, quote, "Well, I'm the best friend that Israel ever had. You look at what happened with all of the things that I've gotten, including Jerusalem being the capital, the embassy getting built," end quote. And he's talking about moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is a picture of Trump and Netanyahu in Jerusalem in 2017. So Trump said that any major event that's happened to Israel in recent years had been given through him, including the normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain known as the Abraham Accords. Trump was then asked what he meant when he said there would be hell to pay if the hostages were not released, a threat that he first made over a month ago. Trump told Hewitt, quote, "If those hostages are not released by the time I get to office, there will be hell to pay. I don't think I have to go into it anymore," end quote. And in this original threat that Trump issued, this was a post on Truth Social. It sounded like he was hinting at U.S. military action against Hamas. He said, quote, "Those responsible will be hit harder than anybody has been hit in the long and storied history of the United States of America. Release the hostages now," end quote. And of course, people compared that to his threat against North Korea, fire and fury. But this is what he's saying, before being inaugurated. So, how is he going to handle this whole situation in Gaza when he first comes into office, which is very soon now? And Israel's most hardline elements have celebrated Trump's victory. They view it as an opportunity to annex the West Bank. And the appointment of Mike Huckabee as the U.S. ambassador to Israel is not a good sign. It's a sign that the U.S. will support more annexation, more land grabs in the West Bank. All right, so the next one here, Mike Waltz claims that Iran is the problem in the Middle East. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So this is 3 stories here about kind of the next Trump administration. The incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, said the Trump administration would target Iran in the Middle East and crack down on pro-Palestinian protesters in the U.S. to support Israel. In an interview with Mark Levine, Waltz explained the philosophy of the incoming administration for the Middle East. He said, quote, "The problems in the Middle East, by and large, originate from Tehran, not from Tel Aviv. We're going to stand by and support our greatest ally in the Middle East. We are aligned from a national security, intelligence, and values standpoint," end quote. He described the policy as instituting a complete philosophical. This is really something here. So he says this idea that Iran's the big problem and that they're going to do whatever Israel wants is a complete philosophical, wholesale national security shift. It's really something how Republicans live in this fantasy land where President Biden is not supportive of Israel and isn't hardline on Iran. It's just a complete fantasy. But just it's incredible to basically say, we're going to do whatever Israel wants, and this is a huge shift in U.S. national security policy. So he said, quote, "We're going to align with our ally Israel. We're going to realign the common interests of the Gulf Arab states with Israel in opposing Iran's aggression. We're going to reinstate maximum pressure. We're going to stop them from selling their illegal oil that has been funding terrorism," end quote. And another thing he said the U.S. military is, quote, "getting worn out shooting missile after missile from this ragtag bunch of Houthis. We're going to get that under control," end quote, saying that they're not happy with the situation, the bombing campaign in Yemen. So is that going to take a path of diplomacy, or is that going to be an escalation? If they're not willing to force Israel to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, that's the only diplomatic way you could get the Houthis to stop. That means that they might escalate the bombing in Yemen. And then he also went on to say that they're going to crack down on the pro-Palestinian protests. He said the U.S. government will, quote, look at mosques, individuals, universities, professors, you name it, that pose a threat to the United States and are radicalizing individuals to harm the United States, end quote. He continued referring to pro-Palestinian campus protesters, basically saying if they're here on a student visa, that they're going to be sent home if they're at protests. I mean, how this is something that we've seen this rhetoric from Trump as well. So I do fear there might be a real domestic crackdown on criticism of Israel. I mean, there's already all these states in this country that have laws on the books, anti-boycott laws, this anti-Semitism definition that includes criticism of Israel. And we might start seeing more of that type of stuff at the federal level. That's something the Republicans really want. And, all the people, when we were talking earlier, a few months ago, or maybe not a few months ago, but when Trump started filling out the cabinet about some people that are kind of better than others that we're seeing put in places, the one common thing between all of them is that they're all pro-Israel, every single one of them, from RFK Jr. to Tulsi Gabbard. So, again, I fear that kind of domestic crackdown is possible. All right, even though RFK isn't going to have any, he's going to be in the health, he's not going to be involved. But anyway, the next one here, Israeli attacks kill 49 Palestinians in Gaza. So this is the daily slaughter continues. Gaza's health ministry said Monday that Israeli attacks across the Gaza Strip killed 49 Palestinians and wounded 75 more as the daily U.S.-backed slaughter continues. The ministry's figures only account for dead and wounded Palestinians who were brought to hospitals. The ministry wrote on Telegram, quote, a number of victims are still under the rubble and on the roads, and ambulance and civil defense crews cannot reach them, end quote. You see this picture here of mourners outside a hospital. And among those killed by Israeli strikes was Thabat Salim, a 30-year-old neonatal doctor who volunteered at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. So this is a doctor who treated newborn babies, the most vulnerable people in Gaza. And she was killed by a strike on her home in central Gaza's Nusayrat refugee camp. There were strikes across Gaza, including the bombing of a town east of Rafah in the south that killed at least 2 children. 7 Palestinians were killed in other Israeli attacks on Rafah. Attacks in the central Barej refugee camp killed 4 Palestinians, and there was heavy strikes in Gaza City, and at least 6 Palestinians were killed in those strikes. So just relentless attacks continue. All right, the next one here. Israel attacks a clearly marked WFP aid convoy in Gaza. So on Monday, the UN's World Food Program said Israeli forces fired on one of the group's aid convoys in Gaza and strongly denounced the attack. The WFP said the convoy was clearly marked and that 16 bullets struck 3 vehicles that were carrying a total of 8 aid workers. None of the aid workers were hurt in the attack, but 16 bullets hit these cars. That's, not just 1 or 2 shots. The World Food Program said the aid convoy had obtained the necessary clearances to operate in the area. So Cindy McCain, who's the head of the World Food Program, and she is the the widow of Senator John McCain, she wrote on X, quote, absolutely unacceptable. A WFP convoy, clearly marked and carrying 8 team members, was shot at by Israeli forces near Wadi Gaza. Despite prior clearances, we must have safe, secure access to continue delivering life-saving aid, end quote. So the Israeli military has targeted aid workers throughout its genocidal war on Gaza. The World Food Program said that this attack came after a missile struck a flour distribution warehouse in central Gaza run by a UN aid partner, and that injured 3 humanitarian workers. And of course, the incident that's the most notorious, back in April 2024, Israel bombed the World Central Kitchen workers, killed 7 of them. 6 of them were foreigners. 1 of them was American. 3 of them were from the UK. So that got a whole bunch of attention, and it was And, that was, if I remember it correctly, they bombed one car. Some survivors got out and went into another car, and then they hit that car. And then there was a third car that those survivors went in, and then they meticulously took out these aid workers. But Israel has taken out hundreds of Palestinian aid workers. UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Relief Agency, says that 263 of its employees have been killed by Israeli forces since October 7th, 2023. All right, so the next one here, an Israeli army dog mauled a pregnant Palestinian woman, then she lost the baby. So this article is from Middle East Eye. This is just a horrific account. Tahrir Husni Al-Aryan, 9 months pregnant, could see pieces of her flesh falling to the ground as an Israeli combat dog savaged her thigh. The Palestinian mother of 3 was at home with her husband and children in Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip when the Israeli military invaded Al-Manara, their neighborhood. It was October 24th, 2024. The dog attack, which lasted about 10 minutes, left Aryan in unbearable pain and caused complications that would last for months, ultimately leading to the loss of her newborn. Since then, the 34-year-old has been unable to return to her home, grappling with deep trauma. In Khan Yunis, she shared her harrowing account with Middle East Eye. So the story started when her family returned to their home after numerous displacements. The area seemed safe with no Israeli forces in sight, but that peace was shattered at around 8 p.m. when the bombardment began. Basically, they took refuge in their brother-in-law's apartment on the lower floor, and nearby homes were destroyed. And she was in there with her husband, children, pregnant sister, and brother-in-law. They were huddled together in the bathroom, and a dog came in by himself with a light on its and a camera on its head. So this is something the IDF does to clear buildings. They send these dogs in, and the dogs attack people. And in one case, they attacked a Palestinian man with Down syndrome, and then this was a horrific story. The Israeli soldiers just left them to die. And now in this case, this woman was attacked and she was wounded very badly. And it was the infection that she had that caused complications. So when her baby was born, he had complications and ended up dying. And these are, just horrors beyond comprehension here. And so the Israeli soldiers let the dog in and attacked her, and then they came in to stop the dog. And then they eventually got the dog off, and she said that they barely even treated her and just kind of left her there, and told her not to tell anybody what happened. So she's been afraid to talk about it, and this is the first time she's come public with the story. All right, so the next one here, testimonies from the Inferno in northern Gaza. So this article is from Haaretz, the Israeli paper, and it's basically just testimony from northern Gaza from Palestinians who've lived through the displacement, the ethnic cleansing campaign. There's a few, I might just read through some random quotes here just so we get an idea of what people have lived through there. So this is from Rania, a 26-year-old from Beit Lahia. As the days went by, the distress became more acute. The sick suffered, especially because the medications had run out and the supply had stopped. Mothers of babies couldn't get diapers, so they ripped up their clothes to make diapers out of them. It was impossible to move. It was impossible to go out. We put pails in the middle of the room for toilets. In the end, we had no choice, and we left. The army forced us to march between dozens of tanks along a narrow route full of dead bodies and body parts. There were hundreds of children with us. They walked next to us and saw everything, end quote. So, man, and these stories get into not just the violence, but also the siege. I mean, these places were put under a total siege. Nothing was allowed in. And you see the shortages she talks about with diapers and everything. So let's see. I'll do one more here. Basil, 27 from Beit Lahia, said, this time wasn't like times before. The army advanced deeply and operated in a very broad way. They worked in an orderly fashion and blew up whole areas. The entire quarter where we lived was destroyed. Even before that, we had to leave our home. But when the army arrived, we had to leave our present house too. It became too dangerous there. We arranged a place for ourselves in a third house with relatives near the Kamal Adwan hospital. Being close to the hospital didn't guarantee that we would be protected. The army attacked Kamal Adwan during this operation and also before that. I have quite a few relatives working on the hospital's medical teams, and some of them were killed. In the meantime, the army is continuing to destroy more and more houses and also farming areas. They're creating a buffer between Gaza City and the towns in the northern strip. And of course, there are casualties all the time. The army is also launching attacks on displaced people, absorption centers, and it's now impossible for me to count how many people that I know who have been killed. Women, children, and it's also impossible to know what has happened to other people. Either they have been arrested by the army or they are buried under the rubble. So lots more quotes here about what people have gone through in northern Gaza. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. issues sanctions waiver for Syria's HTS government. So the U.S. Treasury Department on Monday issued a 6-month general license to waive some sanctions on Syria to allow transactions with the new Syrian government that's led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda and still designated by the U.S. as a foreign terrorist organization. So for years, the U.S. has imposed crippling economic sanctions on Syria that were designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. The sanctions, which have a devastating impact on Syrian civilians, were part of the regime change effort that was ultimately successful against Assad. He fled the country on December 8th in the face of this HTS offensive. In a press release on this general license, which is essentially a sanctions waiver, the Treasury Department acknowledged the scope of the U.S. sanctions on Syria, kind of how big they were. They said that Syria was the most comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction, or one of the most comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions. The license does not lift any sanctions, but allows certain transactions with the HTS-led government. According to the document, the general license allows transactions in support of the sale, supply, storage, or donation of energy, including petroleum. So essentially it allows the purchase and sale of energy and transactions that are ordinarily incident and necessary to processing the transfer of non-commercial personal remittances to Syria, including the Central Bank of Syria. So the Treasury Department, this is interesting, they said the purpose of the license is to ensure that U.S. sanctions do not impede activities to meet basic human needs, including the provision of public services or humanitarian assistance. And that's an acknowledgement that U.S. sanctions have been blocking those things, even though they deny it. History shows us that sanctions always impede, block, and cut off humanitarian goods, and that's essentially an acknowledgement of that. So to be clear, our position is that the U.S. should lift all sanctions everywhere, and when it comes to Syria, it should withdraw troops. But this really goes to show how the U.S. operates, the double standards, the hypocrisy. They have these, really heavy sanctions on Syria designed to hurt the civilian population, designed to prevent reconstruction. Antony Blinken himself said that. Assad gets ousted and a terrorist organization, according to the U.S., a terrorist organization took over the country, and now they're starting to ease some sanctions just because they prefer this to Assad being in power. All right, so the next one here. Turkey foreign minister says it's only a matter of time until Kurd fighters are wiped out. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So another threat from Turkey against the SDF, the Kurdish group that the U.S. backs in northern and eastern Syria. So fighting continued between the Kurds and the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish-backed forces, the SNA. And Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan spoke at a news conference in Ankara on Monday, saying the situation is changing inside Syria, and it is only a matter of time before Kurdish militant groups are totally wiped out. He said they're going to be eliminated. He also warned Western nations against continuing to support the Kurds, insisting that they were using ISIS as an excuse to embolden the PKK. So Turkey's been demanding that the U.S. stop backing the SDF, but there's reports that the U.S. is building a new military base in northern Syria in Kobani. The Pentagon denied that they were setting up a new base, but there's been reports of big U.S. military convoys arriving there. And the thing is that the U.S. always deny, they'll deny that a certain military outpost or facility is a base. They'll say, oh, it's a temporary camp or whatever. So that's how they wiggle around, admitting setting up new bases in Syria and places like that. But the U.S. is showing that they have no intention of withdrawing or dropping their support for the SDF. So we'll see where this goes here. But it's a hairy situation in the north there with Turkey and the SDF. All right, so the next one here, guide for Israeli soldiers to avoid arrest abroad. So the Israeli news site Ynet has published a guide for Israeli soldiers to help them avoid arrest for potential war crimes while traveling abroad. The guide comes after an Israeli soldier visiting Brazil fled the country over an order from a Brazilian court to investigate him for potential war crimes based on social media posts that showed the destruction of Palestinian homes. I mentioned this story yesterday. This was the Hind Rajab Foundation, asked Brazil to pursue charges on this guy because he was in Brazil vacationing and he posted videos demolishing, blowing up civilian homes in Gaza. So he fled, and Israeli soldiers, they've been documenting war crimes on social media. It's really something how much they post. And Israeli media has reported that pro-Palestinian organizations have filed 50 complaints in courts around the world against Israeli soldiers. And this guide that was published by Ynet, they quoted Nick Kaufman, who's an Israeli lawyer who works as a defense lawyer at the International Criminal Court, the ICC. He advised Israeli soldiers not to post as much on social media. He said, quote, soldiers should avoid posting photos or videos from their service, especially content showing destroyed buildings, even if there's a military justification. Such posts violate operational security and could harm Israel's image. Some countries might treat seemingly minor content, such as racist songs, as incitement to genocide, end quote. He said the problem for Israeli soldiers was countries that have adopted the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allows the arrest, investigation, and potential prosecution of people accused of very serious crimes, which include war crimes and genocide. And another warning that he gave, I thought was interesting. They asked him, "Do you think, when the war's over, will it be better for IDF soldiers to travel abroad?" And he said, "Well, actually, it might be worse." And it's interesting what he said. He said, quote, "The threat may not diminish and could even intensify as Gaza opens to human rights groups and foreign journalists," end quote, because foreign journalists, rights groups are going to see all sorts of, the destruction that they're going to see. It's going to be, people in the West and the U.S. who don't really pay much attention to Gaza. If they start seeing Western journalists in there, it'll just get to more people in other countries. And that's one reason why Israel's been keeping them out of Gaza. All right, so the next one here, the Palestinian Authority requests $680 million in security assistance from the U.S. This article is from Middle East Eye. So the Palestinian Authority asked the U.S. to approve a 4-year, $680 million plan to boost the training of its special forces and bolster its supply of ammunition and armored vehicles. An American source and a source close to the Palestinian Authority revealed to Middle East Eye. The request was made in mid-December at a meeting with U.S. security officials at the PA's Ministry of Interior in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. At the meeting, PA security officials expressed frustration over what they believed was the U.S.'s failures to fulfill commitments to the authority by replenishing arms supplies and training special forces. And they're saying that they need this in light of these raids that they've been conducting in the Jenin camp in the West Bank. The PA has been launching these raids against the armed resistance groups. And I think at least 8 have been killed in those clashes so far. And apparently the U.S. is happy with the PA. They've been pressuring the PA to launch offensives against this group. Right now, Israel really, they want infighting between the Palestinians. And I would be very surprised. The Trump administration, the Israeli government wants to dismantle the PA essentially and take over the West Bank. And I would be surprised if the Trump administration signed off on a plan like this. On the other hand, Trump has said very favorable things about Abbas, the leader of the PA. So you never know with Trump. But again, with the people he's putting in charge here, I can't see them approving this plan. All right, so the next one here, the last story, U.S. transfers 11 detainees out of GITMO to Oman. So this is another one from Middle East Eye. The United States sent 11 Yemeni detainees at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility to Oman, the Pentagon said on Monday, leaving 15 people at the infamous detention center, the infamous torture facility that it is. The transfer was initially slated for October 2023, but the October 7th Hamas attack delayed the transfer, according to an admission from U.S. officials. So this brings down the number of prisoners at GITMO to 15. And 6 of them have not been charged with anything. 3 men are also cleared for transfer. So it looks like the Biden administration is trying to get more people out of GITMO in its final weeks here. There was a few other people released recently, so at least GITMO is getting closer to being shut down. At least I don't know if that's something Trump would do or not, but maybe. You never know. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder: should Panama be afraid of Trump's new imperialism? One from Norman Solomon: genocidal president, genocidal politics. One from Caitlin Johnstone: terrorist organization means whatever the U.S. wants it to mean. That's certainly pertinent with the news about Syria. One from Jerry Condon: why Jimmy Carter pardoned draft resistors. And one from William Hartung: the spotlight, will Trump keep promise to rein in war, Inc. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by sharing it, like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps out. If you listen to the podcast, you could leave a review or a rating depending on where you listen. Follow us on social media: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.